Hey everybody! Hollow Knight and Silksong are games filled with literal bugs. Yet, beyond the common bugs, there is what the game calls higher beings, the gods of this universe. And there's a lot of them, and some discussion as to whether some of these even count. But there's the Pale King, also known as the Wyrm, the White Lady, the Radiance, Grandmother Silk, the Nightmare Heart, the Shade Lord, and the Gods of Thunder and the Gods of Rain. You could also include the Abyss Creature, Greyroot, and/or the Twisted Child, the Faithorn, and even Mr. Mushroom, though I won't be talking about them, as I feel they are more like regular powerful beings or forces of nature, rather than straight up gods. And more importantly, none of them fit into the analysis I want to make in this video. The gods of this universe aren't omnipresent or omnipotent. They are, instead, beings who are particularly powerful and have the ability to create life in different ways, but also seemingly capable of dying. Some of them are also capable of birthing or creating demigod-type creatures, like we see with the Vessels, the Weavers, and Hornet. Even though it is a fact that there are many of these gods, neither in Hallownest nor in Farloom we see polytheism develop, but rather each kingdom has monotheist beliefs, and more importantly, we even see at times a fight to be the god of choice among the common bugs. We specifically see this between the Pale King and the Radiance, with her being the original god of Hallownest, only for the Pale King to come in and take that away. And if we analyze the other higher beings, a lot of them share a similar necessity. A necessity for subjects to adore them, to believe in them, or to sustain them in some cases, though it manifests in different ways. Most of the higher beings of this universe seem to need people to follow them in some shape or form. But why is that? However, before I can dive into this need for adoration, I think it's important we do an overview of these higher beings, so we know who they are and so we have the relevant info at hand. Part 1. The higher beings. Big thanks to the wiki since I heavily paraphrased it for this section. Also, if I missed anything important, please let me know in the comments. First up, the Pale King was an ancient Wyrm, a sort of gigantic godlike worm creature. We don't know many details about the Wyrms, but there seem to be many of them in the past. Eventually, the Wyrm made its way to Hallownest, where he shed its shell and took a form more akin to the mortal bugs of the land. Then he gave them elevated minds, that is to say, sapience, asking for their devotion in return. He built the kingdom of Hallownest, and slowly most of the sapient bugs in there eventually revered him, with some exceptions, like the beasts of the hive, the moskin, the mantises, and the weavers of Deepnest, who despite not following him, existed alongside with him in a truce and cooperation. After the infection took over Hallownest, the Pale King and his White Palace disappeared, now only existing in the Dream Realm. And hey, speaking of the infection, the Radiance was one of the higher beings that existed in the lands of Hallownest before the Pale King arrived. She is made out of light and she created the Moth tribe of Hallownest, with the goal of them worshipping her. But when the Pale King arrived, the Moths turned their back on her, and she became forgotten. Enraged by this, and in an effort to be remembered again, she invaded bugs' dreams, taking over their minds, and eventually this evolved into the infection, making almost everyone in Hallownest become united under her, in a mindless hive. On the canon ending, she has become her perfect form, thanks to the Godseeker's attunement, but by bringing her into their dream, the Void sleeps in with her, which forms into the Lord of Shades after the night beats her, killing her for real and stopping her infection of Hallownest. And in Hallownest, we also find the White Lady. She is a root-type creature, being able to move freely in the past, but then purposefully locking her roots in the Queen's Gardens, as to not produce more children, a desire born out of the shame after the atrocities. She was in the lands of Hallownest before the Pale King arrived, but eventually became his wife and Queen of Hallownest. Rather annoyingly for me, and for this video, we don't know of the White Lady having adorers or wanting to have them, but we do know that she took territory from another higher being, Anne, though that was born out of the desire to build her gardens. And hey, since we are on the topic of Anne, let's talk about them. Anne is a giant slug, and I love her. We know little about her, but we do know that she created life in Greenpath from her dream. She was revered by the Moskin, but over time her strength dwindled, and now she resides at the bottom of the Lake of Anne, where she calls for the Moskin. Likewise, the Moskin are waiting for that call, some being able to faintly hear it. Continuing with the Nightmare Heart, this is one of the most interesting higher beings. Unlike most of the others, we can't interact directly with it. We can only see it in the background during the Nightmare King Grim fight. The Nightmare Heart is the strongest power in the Nightmare Realm, a place similar to the Dream Realm, but you know, for nightmares. We don't know much about this place if you couldn't tell. It controls the Grim Troop, a traveling group of bugs who serve the Nightmare Heart, and who search for dying kingdoms where they can find nightmares to sustain the Scarlet Heart, with their leader being Grim. Grim is simultaneously the vessel of the Nightmare Heart. In each new kingdom they visit, they engage in a ritual, the objective of it being to create a new Grim child, who, after enough nourishing, consumes the current troop master, so the Nightmare Heart can keep inhabiting new and healthy vessels. This inhabiting of vessels is interesting, because it doesn't seem to take full control of the subject. Grim isn't a mindless zombie, having clear personality traits and being able to be his own person. Simultaneously though, he does exist as a pawn of the Nightmare Heart, but whether he is conscious of that or not is hard to say. We get the option of banishing the troop instead of completing the ritual, but that only seems to cast them away from Hallownest, rather than fully ending their existence and their endless cycle. Bram is free from it at least, so that's nice. And the last higher being we meet in Hallownest proper is the Lord of Shades, who is really void given form or given focus, so it is like the physical incarnation of a force of nature. The Lord of Shades is the knights themselves after becoming whole when they acquire the Void Heart. Even though the Lord of Shades is usually associated with the massive version we see at the end of Pantheon 5, it's important to note that the version we see in the Dream No More ending also is the Lord of Shades, just a lesser version. If I'm not mistaken, similar to Absolute Radiance, this is like the perfect version, existing thanks to the Godseeker's attunement. And after beating the shit out of the Radiance, it becomes the Gods of Gods in the Godseeker's view. The Lord of the Shades also isn't limited to Hallownest, as we see in Silksong's true ending, being capable of existing wherever there is void. But of course, he isn't the only higher being we see in Silksong. Let's finally move on to Farloom and talk about Grandmother Silk. This is the pale being we know the most about, so I'll try to keep it brief and only mention the info relevant for this video. GMS is the origin of Silk, a physical manifestation of soul. She arrived at Farloom when there already were sapient bugs, and even kingdoms, such as the ones from Carmelita, Khan, and the Green Princess. On her arrival, GMS ascended the Farleads, turning them into weavers and claiming to them that they were her children. At that point, the weavers had to sustain GMS' pale light through their song, but eventually lured her into a sleep, allowing them to take over Farloom and create the Citadel. They could have done something nice, and instead chose this hellhole of a capitalistic theocracy. Why were they like this? The weavers created a religion around the Citadel, encouraging the pilgrims to climb towards it and to join the choir, which constant song would keep GMS in her slumber, but also sustain her pale light, allowing the weavers to use her silk for many purposes, such as extending the lives of bugs. During the weavers' rule, the architects, those in charge of Farloom's machinery, completed the clockwork core. At its top, mechanical statues produced song by using cylinders, making it necessary for the core of bugs to continue singing. But even though they had seemed to found the cheat code to maintaining GMS in her slumber, the weavers eventually realized they could not keep GMS asleep forever, and most of them decided to run away. At that point, GMS threats began seeking out the bugs of Farloom, taking over their minds, in what is known as the Haunting, and everything went to shit. I mean, Farloom was a hellhole already, to be honest. With the powers of her hunting, but still trapped in her slumber, GMS began sending bugs out to capture weavers and their descendants, as to bind them and become stronger. Which leads us to Hornet's capture and the game events, during which GMS begins to wake up, only for Hornet to beat the shit out of her and banish her to the Shadow Realm. Sorry, the Void Sea.
Whoa, is that blackface, dude?
After Lace is dragged down with her, Hornet must go save her as to stop GMS from tearing Farloom apart. Oh yeah, Lace, she's actually pretty important for this video. Lace is a child created purely out of silk by GMS, in an effort to create a child that wouldn't rebel and would actually want her to wake up. Things didn't go as planned though. After removing the void from her using the last bit of silk and strength from GMS, Hornet is able to save Lace, killing GMS in the process. There is one more group of higher beings I want to mention, and that is the Gods of Thunder and the Gods of Rain. These seem to be the gods in the Land of Storms, the Godseeker's original home, but eventually they died and went silent, prompting the Godseeker to go out into the wastes looking for new gods to attune to. And that is literally all we know about these guys. With all of that out of the way, let me actually get into this video's subjects, the higher beings' seeming necessity for adoration. As I laid out the lore for all of them, you may have noticed that the idea of them wanting worshippers, subjects, vessels, or children constantly pops up. But why is this? Part 2. Survival. To answer this question, my first instinct is to jump into the gods need prayer trope. If you don't know, this is a narrative trope in fiction, in which the gods of a world need people to believe in them to actually exist. As they gain more believers, they become stronger, but if they lose them, they get diminished, and if they lose all of them, they can even cease to exist. In this trope, the god and its subjects form a symbiotic relationship, sometimes being mutualistic, in which the god benefits from the belief and the subjects benefit from the powers of the god. I've had the idea for this video for a long time, but it couldn't have been made at a better one, since I recently read Small Gods by Terry Pratchett, which heavily plays with these ideas, and it is also great, go read it. The bottom line with this trope is that the gods need followers to exist, and many of Hollow Knight's higher beings seem to fit into this description. The Radiance creates the moths for them to revere her, and once they forget her and revere someone else, she begins to fade away. GMS creates the Weavers and has them sustain her light through their song. Anne loses her power over time, apparently due to her losing followers to the Radiance and the infection, and the Pale King similarly looks as if he lost his strength as he lost his worshippers to the Radiance, eventually only capable of existing in the Dream Realm, and in the end, he even kicks the bucket in there, though the Godmaster does say that his power still lingers on Hallownest. The Nightmare Heart doesn't seem to need followers per se, but he does need a vessel to inhabit the world, and physical bugs to sustain him with the flames of nightmares. In regards to the strength granted by belief, there is no clearer example of this than the Godseeker's attunement. It is thanks to her worship that the Radiance can become its perfect form, and what allows the Knight after beating her to turn into Void-given focus instead of Void-given form like in the Dream No More ending. This narrative trope would explain the constant fighting for subjects between the higher beings, and why the kingdoms we inhabit end up skewing over to monotheism. More so than being a natural result of bug culture shifting, it just ends up being forced upon them, with the gods of this universe constantly fighting for their adoration in a fight for survival. There's no more clear of an example than the conflict between the Radiance and the Pale King, with him literally usurping her place, only for it to come back to bite him in the ass. Massively. We also see it with Anne losing her followers to the infection. And there is one more case of this search of survival by eliminating the other gods, though it is somewhat speculative on my part. In the Abyss, besides the Void, there is the Abyss creature, who seems to be the origin of Lifeblood, or at the very least, strongly connected to it. In Hollow Knight, we find Johnny's corpse and alongside it, Johnny's blessing, a charm which description says as following: "Blessed by Johnny, the kindly heretic." The usage of the word heretic plus the isolated location we find Johnny in makes me believe he was someone who preached about Lifeblood in a religious manner, so the Pale King had him banished and killed, subsequently locking the Abyss creature room. It could also be that this was motivated by fear of the danger of Lifeblood, or maybe the room was locked already and Johnny died of a Lifeblood overdose. The Abyss creature also doesn't really behave like most other higher beings, seeking out followers, but I think this is at least interesting to think about. Following along with the idea about the need of these gods to enforce monotheism, the only seemingly polytheist beliefs we know of are in the Godseeker's original home, where they worship multiple gods. I bring it up because maybe the reason these gods went silent and died was because they accepted polytheism to be their subjects' approach to religion, meaning none of them got enough prayers of their own to remain strong. In their lack of competition for their subjects' attention, they doomed themselves. This is really speculative, but it fits with the deaths or weakenings of higher beings in this universe, and it is notable that the only polytheist pantheon of this world outright failed to continue to exist. With all of that being said, there are some issues with this line of thinking. First up, it's simply not true for every higher being. The most notable example is the White Lady. Not only she doesn't seem to need followers for strength, but also outright never seeks them out, making her a terrible subject for this video about higher beings wanting adoration. Another notable example is the Void. The Void is more so a force of nature that just exists regardless of belief. Sure, the ancient civilization did revere it as a godlike entity, and the Knight is able to give it form, giving it more power, but the Lord of Shades exists independently of followers. I mean, by the time it actually takes shape, no one is revering it like a god anymore. The Godseeker attunement does seem to give it strength like I mentioned, but it definitely doesn't fit the mold as well. We also have problems with this explanation when you consider some of the higher beings' existence prior to having believers. The Pale King, the Radiance, Anne, and GMS all existed perfectly fine before having them. They almost seem to be at the peak of their power, being capable of creating life and/or elevating lesser bugs. One possible solution to this particular issue is that the higher beings have limited power once they pop into existence, quickly needing to create and/or find bugs to worship them. That could explain why the rest of the Wyrms cease to exist, with only the Pale King remaining, though in a different way. The Wyrms either refused to or were unable to establish their own kingdoms, unlike the Pale King, and eventually died off when they had no subjects. That would fit nicely with the so-called Battle of the Black Wyrm, mentioned in the White Defender's journal entry. Beyond its name, we literally don't know anything about this event, but some people have theorized that the giant corpse, where the Colosseum of Fools is inside of, is a Wyrm, specifically the Black Wyrm. It would even seem that the king of the fools was this black worm that, similarly to the Pale King, shed its shell and took a form more akin to mortal bugs. Regardless of if this corpse is actually the worm in question or not, the battle of the black worm could have happened because another worm attempted to take rule of Hollow Nest and its subjects, in a desperate attempt to guarantee its own survival, but was stopped by the Pale King and the 5 Knights. But on the other hand, we also have to consider that some of the higher beings are able to come back into power from a weakened state, even after losing their believers. GMS doesn't seem to have proper followers anymore in current day Farloom, as too many of the bugs in there don't even know of her existence, and the singing has stopped coming from real bugs, and yet she still is able to slowly wake up from her slumber and take over bugs with the haunting. Similarly, the Radiance was able to infect everyone and take over Hollow Nest while at her lowest point, with everyone having forgotten her. And to this point, I don't really have a way of answering, it just kind of breaks the idea of higher beings needing prayer to survive. I honestly really like the idea of the need of adoration coming from a survival necessity, but while there's certainly ground for it, it's also very speculative, and there may be other, more logical reasons for their need of subjects. Part 3. Dominance and Imperialism. A far less complex, but probably even more valid explanation is that the need for adoration is simply baked into the higher being's identity. Hornet certainly believes so. More specifically, Hornet states that the Pale Beings in particular have a tendency for dominance, and that even she feels it as the child of one of them. I haven't talked about Pale Beings because the distinction wasn't relevant yet, but Pale Beings are a category of higher beings. The Pale King, the White Lady, and Grandmother Silk are Pale Beings. The distinction is based on a couple of aspects. First up, Pale Beings have a strong connection to Soul itself, the energy that animates all living bugs in this universe. They are able to manipulate it in different ways. The Pale King seemingly used it to elevate bugs, and the King's Soul Charm, a representation of the union between him and the White Lady, can generate soul infinitely. In the case of GMS, her silk is a physical manifestation of soul. Her silk can be used to power up attacks, grant longer life, and make physical objects. While the Radiance and Un create the Moth Tribe and the Moth King respectively, seemingly out of thin air, simply by dreaming them up, the Pale King and GMS can't do that. Instead, their powers allow them to elevate lesser bugs, and give them sapience and new capabilities. But the bugs weren't granted life by them. GMS can create life out of her silk, like she does with Lace and Phantom, but it does seem somewhat artificial. The point is that Hornet, who is part Pale Being as well, informs us that the Pale Beings simply desire dominance and followers, it is their nature. Which, yeah, it is an answer to this video's question, I guess, but kind of a boring one. Why do Pale Beings want adoration? Oh, just because they do. Okay, cool, I guess. However, I don't know how accurate this really is. The Pale King and GMS certainly fit the bill, but the White Lady not so much. She is very chill. From what we see in game and know from the lore, the White Lady doesn't seem to pursue dominance over other bugs. She was married to the Pale King, who did do that, but there's no evidence of her in particular attempting to get bugs to revere her. This could simply be attributed to inconsistent writing, but I always find it disingenuous to engage with art in such a way. Instead, I think it's much more feasible that Hornet is simply wrong, and does not know the secrets of this universe. After all, unlike me, she's actually busy having a job, and then trying not to get killed. She can't be out here theory crafting. Another possible explanation as to why the White Lady doesn't present this instinct for dominance is that she did have that tendency as well in the past, but after the atrocities, she had a change of heart, and her retreat was also a way of letting bugs be free of her dominance over them. After all, we do know that Pale Beings can change and move past this instinct. Hornet is part Pale Being, and like she says, I'll not deny some part of me desires that outcome. Dominance, it seems, is baked deep in my blood, as to, no doubt, for the one up top. And yet, another part resists. A part, over time, I find myself siding with more. That part wishes not to claim a monarch's mantle. Rather, it would see my freedom regained, and this kingdom's bugs unshackled from their pale chains. She is able to move past her own instinct for dominance, after learning enough of Farloom and coming to appreciate the mortal bugs that live there. GMS also has a similar change. Despite her need for dominance, she is able to move past it during the game's ending as to save Lace. Her love for her daughter becomes stronger than her instinct. This change is seemingly motivated by strong emotions, and I'd say the guilt of the atrocities would certainly be a strong emotion. But even beyond that, even if we do consider this answer, it's only sufficient for some of these higher beings, and it is an inconsistent answer. First of all, with the exception of these three, the rest aren't Pale Beings, and many of them still show a need for dominance. In particular, the Radiance. She initially doesn't want dominance, only reverence from the Moth Tribe, which I know sound like similar things, but I do feel like there is some distinction. Dominance is an active subjugation over its subjects, which can include spiritual adoration, whereas reverence is purely spiritual adoration. The Radiance never seem to physically interact with the Moth tribe or affect their real-world environments, with them simply adoring her and her light. But after she was forgotten and became a salty bitch, she certainly looks to enact dominance upon her return. Through the infection, she bounds the minds of bugs to her, dominating them into a singular hive mind. In the same way that the desire for dominance can be taken away from pale beings by strong emotions, the opposite is true for other higher beings. Through strong emotions, the desire for control and dominance can be instilled in them, even when not previously there. Though it isn't that surprising. Someone who creates life purely to have them revere them certainly has traits of a megalomaniac. Another higher being that isn't a pale being, who we see dominate other bugs from the very beginning, is the Nightmare Heart, and this one is even worse than the rest. The members of the Grim Troop seem to be almost like slaves, unable to challenge the Scarlet Flame. The Grim Troop members serve the Heart directly, but there is also these guys. They only seem to exist as spectators of the ritual, both during the fight against Grim and inside his nightmare. All of the members of the audience and of the troop have masks with these lids going over their eyes, and we can find this secret room with a stockpile of them. Masks are kind of a mysterious thing in the Hollow Knight universe, while simultaneously extremely important, but the relevant aspect to them is that they tend to define the bug's identity and personality. I think the particular masks we see everyone in the troop use could be what is keeping them in service to the Nightmare Heart. Regardless of why is it that they are bound to this higher being, it certainly feels non-negotiable. Even if one of them becomes conscious of their servitude, like Bram does, they still need the help of a third party to help them break free. They can't destroy the lantern on their own. But besides the higher beings that also seek dominance and aren't pale beings, there's the higher beings that outright don't seek it, making this second answer unsatisfactory when looking at why they may need adoration. First up is Anne, who doesn't subjugate her people. The Moskins' following of her seems much more voluntary compared to how the other higher beings relate to their subjects. While Anne gave them life, there is no indication that she did so with the sole purpose to have bugs revere her, and the relation between them seems born out of a genuine care and religious admiration. I love Anne, she rules. There's also the Lord of Shades, who is out of the mold in every aspect compared to the other higher beings, and who is useless for the purposes of this video, since it doesn't seek adoration at all. That being said, when the old civilization did revere it, it was born out of their own desire to have the void cleanse them. For some reason. The Lord of Shades hadn't even come into existence proper at that point either, the void still being divided and without form. Beyond whether domination is baked into the higher beings or not, I'm interested in how their domination over bugs is presented in both of these games, from a thematic and narrative standpoint. The first question that comes to mind is, why kingdoms? The obvious answer is that these are political systems that have clear hierarchies. That have clear hierarchies. The obvious answer is that these are political systems that have clear hierarchies. But why even create complex political systems to have bugs revere them? Why did the Pale King need to create a kingdom instead of dominating the bugs of Farloom in a wilder way? Same goes for GMS. I think this is another difference between Pale Beings and the rest of the higher beings. Pale Beings seem much more inclined into empire building and political structures, whereas the rest seem content with dominating over their creations in a much more loose way. The Nightmare Heart seems to reveal in dying empires, and the Radiance in particular outright destroys the Kingdom of Hollow Nest, instead of trying to take over its already existing structures. This could be because the non-pale beings are more akin to forces of nature. The Nightmare Heart is the fire of nightmares, the Shade Lord is void given focus, and Anne seems to be a creative force of nature. On the contrary, pale beings are much more human-like in their existence, probably explained by their strong connection to soul. I don't have much of a conclusion for this analysis, to be honest. I just believe it's cool to think about. Yeah, okay, moving on. Part 4. Ego. This explanation is much simpler and stupider even, but I still want to talk about it. Higher beings need adoration because they are arrogant. Yes, that's the explanation. I am very good at analyzing media in complex and thought-provoking ways. In all seriousness, I do think their ego may play a massive role into why they need adoration. One answer as to why they fight for followers is the aforementioned strength granted by them. But as we already saw, there were flaws in that line of thinking. So another explanation is that they simply cannot tolerate coexisting with other gods, and need to position themselves as the superior beings. We may even say as the higher being.
Oh my god! Oh jeez, oh my god!
if the followers aren't necessary for their survival, on a practical sense, there was nothing stopping the Pale King from being worshipped alongside the Radiance. She was revered by the tribe of moths specifically, and he could have had the rest of Hallownest to himself. Well, except for the Mantises. And also the Mothkin. And Deep Nest. And the Hive. I'm starting to think the Pale King was a fraud. But most of Hallownest wasn't enough for him. The moths were eventually lured into revering him instead of the Radiance, and we all know how well that worked out. Higher beings simply cannot fathom opposing higher beings, which also fits into their imperialistic and power-hungry tendencies I described in the previous section. I know these explanations are kind of bare bones, but if dominance is baked into their identity, why couldn't ego be too? However, yet again, there are holes in this answer. The Nightmare Heart, and the Shade Lord don't present arrogance in any way or a desire to be the sole god. The Shade Lord in particular does fight the Radiance, but that is because they are elemental and ideological opposites. There is another aspect to the rule of higher beings that isn't necessarily an answer as to why they crave adoration, but constantly appears as a thematic throughline to many of these characters, and I think it is just as interesting as everything else I've discussed, if not more. Part 5. Mommy and Daddy Issues. Many of the relationships between the higher beings and their followers have a paternalistic aspect to them. Hollow Knight, but especially Silksong, have a lot of themes of parenthood, with the latter being heavy on motherhood, to the point that I think that could be its own video, and maybe I'll make it someday. I don't know if I feel capable of doing so right now. It's understandable that this theme comes up constantly, since higher beings are in many ways parents to the bugs they give life to or whose minds they elevate. This parent aspect isn't present in all of them though, the most notable exception being once again the Lord of Shades, because it doesn't have any followers proper. But in regards to the rest, they certainly range in their quality as parents. As usual, Anne is the best. She seems to actually care for the Mothkin, wanting them back into her life, and the feeling is reciprocated. The Mothkin want to be able to join her dream. When analyzing it through the motherhood lens, Anne, despite her seeming care for her children, takes the shape of an absent parent, even though it is clearly not intentional. She isn't a deadbeat mom or anything like that. But it is interesting how she failed to keep both her role of mother and god, with the Mothkin beginning to confuse the Radiance for Anne, Kill for Light for Anne, similarly to what we see with the scarring Farlum confounding Carmelita for GMS. The Radiance similarly loses her children to the Pale King, which is what motivates her rage and the infection. It's almost sympathetic, but then you remember she created the moth to revere her specifically, and it's like, yeah, fuck her, which leads to one of the defining characteristics of many of the higher beings in relation to their children. They see them as extensions of themselves. Radiance expects reverence from the moth tribe and sees them as a part of her light, which to her credit they were actually born from. In the case of the Pale King, he doesn't see his subjects as children, but we do see a similar pattern in the way he views his actual children, the Vessels. He sees the Vessels as creations to be used as weapons to defend his kingdom, rather than as real people. They are a tool to be used for his own benefit first and foremost. The Nightmare Heart has enslaved children who they used to inhabit the physical realm. It doesn't get more literal if you're looking for parents seeing their children as extension of themselves. And Grandmother Silk sees the Weavers so much as a part of herself that after they escape, she demands that they and their descendants are brought back so she can bind them once again to herself, which is why Hornet is brought to Farlum in the first place, and that results in GM's death. A lot of backfiring with these higher beings' plans, huh? We see a similar thing in the way she views both Phantom and Lace, who are creations from her own silk, quite literally an extension of herself. While I'm certainly not qualified to diagnose the cartoon bugs as narcissists, especially since we don't know enough about their personalities, viewing children as an extension of themselves is one of the key traits of narcissistic parents. And another important one we see present in some of these higher beings is that their love is conditional. The love for their children is only existent while they do what they desire them to do. We specifically see this in the Radiance, the Pale King, and GMS. It's always these three up with their bullshit. In the case of the Radiance, we must look at the Moth tribe, since they were her children. Now, this is some speculation, since we don't know for a fact what happened to the Moths, but I believe they were the first target of the Radiant's wrath. And the crutch of this belief relies on Markoth. That bastard! We find Markoth's corpse in Kingdom's Edge, and I believe it was the infection that killed him. He seemed like a capable warrior, and his initial dialogue shows erratic signs of aggression, similarly to the infected enemies of Hallownest. That being said, I'm glad this bastard died to the infection, and I hope it was painful. He deserves the 9th circle of hell. We also see this conditional love with the Seer's ascension. Only once she apologizes to the Radiance and remembers her, she is able to turn into an essence similar to that of the Radiance. Only after meeting the condition for love, that being adoration, she can meet up with her god once again. I know Radiance is somewhat finicky, but we see this conditional love even more clearly with the Pale King and GMS. In the case of the Pale King, like I already mentioned, the vessels are a tool for him, not actual children. In his defense, it's because they needed to be emotionless and whatnot, so their will could not be broken by the Radiance, but still. That being said, the vessel that, at least initially, meets the purpose the Pale King set out for it is the Hollow Knight. And because they are able to meet the desires of the Pale King, is that he actually feels love for them. Love in the way a narcissistic parent can love, but love nonetheless. But yes, that love is conditional, it only happens because the Hollow Knight is able to achieve what's expected of him. In the case of GMS, her conditional love is taken to the extreme. She loves and cares for the Weavers, but only while they serve their purpose of sustaining her, and the moment they betray her, the conditional love is gone, replaced instead by a murder rampage. GMS only treats them as daughters to get the feeling of love she wants in return. Like narcissists, she craves love and validation to shield her own emotions. And when they betray her, besides the murder rampage, her first instinct is to create new children who won't rebel. Both Phantom and Lace seem a lot less capable of acting against GMS, at least until Lace eventually does. That could be because she is literally spun from Mami Silk's own thread, which makes it easier for GMS to love her, since the condition for her love is easier to be kept. That being said, by the end of Silksong, she is able to show love without this condition, and she acts to save Lace, not looking for admiration or love in return, but rather from a genuine attempt to serve Lace's physical and emotional needs instead of her own. And actual narcissists don't do this. This is a personality disorder, not a character flaw that is fixed by working on yourself. At best, it can be treated by going to therapy, and I highly doubt that Grandmother Silk was seeing a psychologist while inside her cocoon. The patterns of narcissism in parenthood are definitely present, but it is hard to accurately designate these characters as such, and at this point of the script, I don't feel capable of doing anything more than simply pointing out the narcissistic qualities like a damn soy jack and calling them interesting. Is it because I am not competent enough to write a cohesive video essay? Or is it because I am reaching at straws? Or is it simply because there's not enough in the text to come to a factual and satisfying idea about the narcissism present in some of these higher beings? Or hell, maybe it's all of those reasons. I started writing this fifth part simply because I wanted to make an interesting thematic analysis about the figure of flawed parenthood in these games, but I do think it kind of ends up harking back to the initial question of this video. Do the higher beings want adoration as a shield for their self-esteem because they are narcissists, more specifically narcissistic parents? Maybe, why the hell not at this point? But similar to all of the other answers I've given throughout this video to the question of why the higher beings need adoration, this line of thinking is, once again, flawed. Because not only we don't have enough info to properly catalog any of these higher beings as narcissists according to the DSM-5 criteria, but the ones who show narcissistic traits are only a handful of the higher beings. Nor the Lord of Shades, nor the White Lady, nor Ant, nor the Gods of Thunder and Rain, remember those fuckers, show any of the narcissistic traits found in the Nightmare Heart, the Radiance, the Pale King, or GMS. And while I find all of these analyses compelling, I don't have much of a grander point, and at this moment I feel like this video is turning into a messy yapping session. I wanted to make this video because I noticed an interesting repetition with how the gods need adoration, and now I have 20 tabs open about narcissism and Hollow Knight lore. What the fuck is going on? Okay, part final, conclusion I guess. So, for my own sake, and so this video doesn't turn into even more of a total disaster, let's see about wrapping this up and coming up with a conclusion, shall we? Let's circle back to the initial question of this video. Why do the higher beings seek adoration? Hell if I know! None of the reasons I gave is sufficiently satisfactory to answer this conundrum. It could be all of them, why the hell not? The frustrating thing about trying to get an answer for any question that involves lore analysis is that these games have purposefully obfuscated lore. They give you an outline of what happened and a general understanding of the world and characters, but much of the details necessary to put together a cohesive narrative for some of these deeper questions are missing by design. For fuck's sake, none of the characters I discussed today even have dialogue. The closest we get is historical quotes and words spoken unto the night through a back-sized dream sword. Team Cherry want people to interpret their worlds and not come up with a concrete answer, at least to some questions. So, when I set out to make this video and attempt to answer this question, which no one forced me to do by the way, I was setting myself up to failure. However, even if I'm unable to come up with a satisfying and concrete answer, I think the deeper point at display is that this world and narratives are endlessly enjoyable to analyze, and I had a great time researching and writing this video, even with the slight feeling of being overwhelmed towards the end of it. Truly, the higher beings' need for adoration was the friends we made along the way. So, for a conclusion, all I can say is that I hope you also found it interesting, and I look forward to seeing your own thoughts and mental breakdowns in the comments below. If you want to see more stuff like this, or just want to see me analyze and gush about the stuff I love in the form of rankings, subscribe and all that. Okay everybody, have a nice day.